Hey guys, Ranger James here with Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park. We're back with another exciting episode of our museum tour series. So today we're going to be highlighting some really interesting things, mainly hygiene, and we're going to touch a little bit on tactics. We did touch on hygiene before when we talked about Civil War medicine, but we're going to actually go into the different implements of hygiene today. What I have behind me is one of our cases. We actually call it a lawn case, and this is going to highlight a lot of the different accoutrements that the Civil War soldiers would have had, whether that be out in the field or while they're out campaigning, as well as some arms and armaments here on your right hand side. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about some really interesting things that we have in this case that have survived since the 1860s. One, of course, being this haversack liner that you see here is just a tan bag, roughly 1 foot by 1 foot in dimension. Now the reason why that's so interesting is because it's really hard for something like that sort of fabric to survive as long as it has. And it's neat that we have it here in this collection. What that would have been used for is to carry your personal items, to carry your food. Basically, it was a precursor to what we would think of as a lunchbox. Now, speaking of lunch, you can't eat hardtack without drinking some water. And we also have a Civil War canteen. Now, the one that we have here, you can see it's blue, circular in shape. It's got a strap as well as a plug. This would have been used by the Union Army, and I just so happen to have one over here that was gifted to the park for use with our Life of a Soldier events. And this is as close to historically accurate as you can get. Again, lined in blue wool, and the idea for that was while you're bending down and taking in the water, that wool would get nice and wet and it'd keep the liquid inside cool. Now, what is this made out of? Well, it's actually made out of 2 tin plates that are welded together using lead. So not only are these soldiers risking the chance of infection and disease by having to get their water from things like streams, lakes, rivers, sometimes even mud puddles, the water's brown anyways, because for one, the inside, it's rusting, and they're slowly poisoning themselves with all of that lead that's there, meant to hold this thing together. The Confederate counterpart of this would have been made from wood, which you would think would be a disadvantage, but it obviously turned out to be an advantage. Now, the most important piece of equipment that these Civil War soldiers had, can you guess what it is? A lot of people say it's your rifle. That's probably your second most important. The most important piece of equipment for these Civil War soldiers is the shoe. And I have a pair here. And this is what was known as Jefferson booties. So I'll give you a second to get over that. But Jefferson booties is the first time in American military history that both a left shoe and a right shoe is crafted for your feet. Before, what they would do is they would have just a straight shoe, and you put your foot inside and you kind of wedge it in and kind of form it to a right shoe or a left shoe. So this is the first time they've had left or right. It's made out of leather, and it is clunky. Now these are brand new, but it's just like if you were to try and wear the most thick, dense dress shoes that you have, think Frankenstein shoes. Now, typically what you would do while you're out on a campaign is every day you'd be marching 15, 20, sometimes even 30 miles. And oftentimes these did not survive very well. So again, resources, very important. A lot of people don't understand that this was the first modern war, and what served that modernity was the railroad line, the ability to get supplies like this to places like Kennesaw Mountain. And Ranger Amanda Corman did an awesome video about a week ago highlighting the railroad that came by Kennesaw Mountain. Now, another thing that's interesting is hygiene itself. These people, they cared for their bodies as best as they could while they were out on the march. Typically, you would go several weeks, several months without bathing. And when you did bathe, you would usually bathe in a river. But they would have some tricks to try and get around a lot of these things. Now, back then, it's a brand new invention, but it is something that they had, the toothbrush. So nowadays, toothbrushes are made of plastic, and they've got some sort of synthetic bristles That's not the case back in the 1860s. There was no plastic back then. So what you had was a piece of bone, and the bristles were made from the chin hair of a wild boar. And that's what you would brush your teeth with. Now, something interesting that I just found out is a lot of people at the time, for advertisements with these, they thought that this was just the modern advertisement, that this was just a tricky thing that you didn't actually need. And if you were lucky enough to have one of these in your home, oftentimes it was shared among the whole family, if you can imagine that. Well, what did they use for toothpaste? Well, they had a sort of powder that they would mix up, usually made out of baking soda, sometimes sugar, to give it some flavoring. And oftentimes, in order to get that nice, sparkly, clean, white look and sensation, what they would do is they would take some ashes out of the fire, the charcoal, and rub it on their teeth. What did they use for hair gel? Well, bacon grease, as best as we can figure. Now, something else that's interesting at the time that a lot of people don't think of when they think of soldiers on the march is parasites. So not only do you have to deal with disease, you have to deal with the enemy, you have to deal with hard days, but you also have to deal with the bugs. And Georgia is known for its bugs. It's mosquitoes, it's ticks, it's chiggers. We have an account from a Civil War soldier who was actually here. He fought at the Battle of the Dead Angle during the assault of June 27th, 1864. His name is Sam Watkins. He has a very famous book, a series of memoirs called Company H, spelled phonetically. Company H, sideshow to the big show. And he's going to talk about the lice problem. We went into summer quarters at Tupelo. Our principal occupation at this place was playing poker, chuck-a-luck, and cracking graybacks, otherwise known as lice or ticks. Every soldier had a brigade of lice on him, and I've seen fellows so busily engaged in cracking them that it reminded me of an old woman knitting. At first, the boys would go off in the woods and hide and louse themselves, but that was unnecessary. The ground fairly crawled with lice. Pharaoh's people, when they were resisting old Moses, never enjoyed the curse of lice more than we did. The boys would frequently have a louse race. There was one fellow who was winning all the money. His lice would run quicker and crawl faster than anybody's lice. We could not understand it. If some fellow happened to catch a fierce-looking louse, he would call on Dornan, which was the man, for a race. Dornan would come and always win this stake. The lice were placed in plates. Speaking of, we have a plate just behind me. You can see with some utensils on top made out of tin. The lice were placed in plates. This was the race course, and the first that crawled off was the winner. At last, we found out old Dornan's trick. He always heated his plate before the race. So, kind of interesting, a little bit humorous. Again, Sam Watkins, Company H, the first, what would become the first 27th Tennessee Confederate Army that, again, fought here at Kennesaw Mountain. Now, we'll go into the second most important piece of equipment for these soldiers, and we'll just touch on this briefly. It's a really deep, intricate topic, but we're just going to touch on it in this video. We don't want it to get too long. But the firearms of the day, most notably long rifles. And over here we have some great examples of long rifles and the kinds of arms that the average infantry soldier during the Civil War would have carried. Now, all of them are from the Civil War, except for the last one that we have down here, this Henry rifle. This is a reproduction. Well, everything else, this gives you a good idea of what these guys would have carried. These are infield rifles. Sometimes you would have Springfield rifles as well. They would be loaded from, I basically call it the barrel, from the top of the barrel. And a good soldier could fire 3 rounds every minute. And that's really running fast. There was a series of 9 different steps, really 12, in order to load and fire this weapon effectively. Range was not all that well, but again, these were rifles. So on the inside of the barrel, you would have rifling, which is grooves that are marked into the barrel that allows the bullet to have a spin. Now, when we think, and this is really important for the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, Typically, when we think of Civil War battles, we think of like what we would see in the Patriot, for instance, which is Revolutionary War. But you'd have two different armies lining up at close proximity. They'd fire volleys at each other. Nowadays, we'd wonder what that was all about. That seems kind of silly to us now. But back then, before the Civil War, what you had was I'll call them unrifled muskets, so smooth bore muskets, and that range was incredibly bad. You basically had a max range of maybe 300 yards, in which the best thing that you could hope for as a commander is to get all your guys in a line together, as close proximity as they could be, as close together as they could be, fire volleys at each other, because that was really one of the only ways that you could hit anything, and then you would fix bayonets and you would charge. Well, with this new modern war that's breaking out, the Civil War, with these nice new rifles that we have here, it increases the range sometimes up to 5 times as much. So the beginning stages of the war, these guys are using what's known as those Napoleonic style tactics, taken from what we have here. This is a copy of Hardee's Infantry Manual. It's a tactic book. Now, General Hardee himself would serve as a Confederate commander. He would actually be over the Confederate forces here at Kennesaw Mountain down at Cheatham Hill. But he literally wrote the book on infantry tactics. It goes into how to stand, it goes into movements, everything that you would need to know about fighting with smooth bore muskets. Both armies are playing off of the same book. But they quickly realize, up against these nice new rifles, that those tactics do not stand a chance. We have to understand that back during the Civil War, this book is what they're pulling from when they teach the officers at places like VMI, the Citadel, West Point. And so this is what these Civil War officers are taking with them into the field, the level of knowledge. When they finally get to the carnage and the butchery and the mass casualty situations that they're incurring because of this new technology, a lot of the times the generals, they don't know what to make of it. And it's really easy for us now to look back on history and say, well, why did this general do that? Why did he order a charge out in the open? At the time, they were trying to do what they could with what they had, with the knowledge that was available. And a lot of times they had to kind of make it up as they were going on with this evolving battlefield. Well, how does that connect with Kennesaw Mountain battlefield? Well, as the war progresses, they begin to see that those old tactics, they're not doing the trick. Too many people are dying. And this has become more or less a war of attrition. So as you get into these battles, like what's happening here in the Atlanta campaign, they quickly realize that the best way to keep your guys safe and to inflict as many casualties to the enemy as possible is to dig entrenchments. Entrenchments for both your men and your cannon. And a heavily entrenched enemy, one Confederate would say, was worth half a dozen soldiers out in the open charging against them. And that proves to be the case here at Kennesaw Mountain. So even though we usually think of the Civil War as being, again, these two armies fighting out in the open in an open field, you got to remember, later on in the war, places like here, that really wasn't the case. The closest thing that we have to the battle that was experienced here would be the trench warfare that was experienced 50 years later in France during World War I. Just as nasty, just as muddy, just as violent as that. And that's what these guys had to experience. Well, I'd like to thank you guys for watching this video. Again, I hope that you guys get to come out sometime and experience the battlefield for yourself. Until then, this is James Pratt, and I hope to see you at the mountain.